Welcome to Bonehead Weekly. We've always tried through over 300 and some episodes. It's so hard to introduce somebody because clearly, Mr. Penney, John, we've been talking back and forth before we got this interview started. It's like, welcome. And he was like, hey, I'm glad to be here. And I always think it sounds like such bullshit. But we are so happy for you to be here. You are not only a writer, you're a director, you're a producer, and I was going back rewatching some of your movies, and we'll get to that in a minute. So, welcome to Bonehead. We appreciate
Thank
it.
you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Happy to be here. This is
Well,
cool.
just not,
I
let's not,
did look at your YouTubes and I saw your basement. I said, now I feel at home. You
yeah,
can you can see by my my trophy room, it's like we're in the same ballpark here.
absolutely. So, when we bought the house, it's a ranch on a walkout, and I was like, I have to have a basement. I was the particular one, and so well, why do you? It's like because of this. I've been 40 some years collecting all this, so
Love it.
completely natural house. And then when you do that bourbon tour with us, it's always the weirdest thing because people ask me to come see my basement. I was like, yeah, you want to see my basement? It's the
Of
weirdest thing.
course.
But of course, so to go ahead and get started, it's a question that I love asking because we don't really go after a lot of actors. We love writers, producers, production designers, artists, directors. We want behind the scenes people. The reason being is because not only do you all have the best stories, you're actually there for the movie. No offense to a lot of actor friends that I've had, but they sometimes are in their trailer and not there for the actual making of
You're
the
the
movie.
first person who's ever articulated that in a way that is so true. Everyone wants to put the actors forward because obviously when I was a kid, I thought honestly actors were making up what they said,
Yeah, we
and
all
they were
do.
sort of the movie. And it wasn't until um, I got a copy of a script in a paperback form that I realized, oh my God, somebody wrote this. And it blew my mind. I thought actors were doing everything. But you're right, actors generally have a very kind of limited perspective on how the whole process is.
They have an extremely limited, and don't get me wrong, I told you about my side gig before we started. It's almost always actors. A lot of them, it's something well, I shouldn't say a lot, but several have we've become friends over the years just because of how it is, and you just hit it off. But I always, if I have to on my own channel interview someone, it's almost always going to be somebody behind the scenes because it's a good friend of ours. I don't know if you know him, Mick Strawn. He's a production designer on Nightmare on Elm Street 3 or 4, did a lot of work for New Line in the 80s and 90s. He's only those people are going to tell you about the back of the 6 foot trailer or the 6 feet in the back of the trailer where the cocaine was.
Well, that was the 80s after all.
Right? I mean, you
I
just,
survived. I'm okay.
and
I
so
did
did
it.
he.
Yes. I have to confess, there were a lot of long nights in the 80s when I was cutting dialogue where a flatbed was used for more than just cutting film. I'm just going to leave it at that.
Yes, rails were done, and we're not talking about
Yes,
the necessary, but those great
exactly.
stories. So, what I like to do is, if you don't mind, it's very cliche, but I always love to ask the question is, what was the bug that bit you? What was the movie that, oh my God, this is it. This is what happened. This is where, because most geeks, I'm assuming you're a geek like the other two, there's that one movie or that instance or something in the childhood. It's like, oh, I don't know what that is, but I got to get at that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question.
Thank you.
For me, there are sort of two tracks to this. One was genre movie. What was the genre movie that did it for me? And then in cinema in general,
Hmm.
uh, we were a family. My father was a journalist. My mother's a novelist, short story writer. I grew up
Hmm.
around, writers,
Yes,
essentially,
absolutely.
wordsmiths. That was the family business. And the one thing I said was, I never want to be a writer, ever, 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 because it just seemed so boring. They were just sitting there typing away on a typewriter, and I didn't know the storm that was going on inside their head at the time, and that idea that needed to get out.
Hmm.
Um, so I grabbed it, and we didn't have a TV. We were not allowed to have a television. So my father, after the divorce, my parents divorced, my father would take us every Wednesday, because that's when movies changed back in the old days. And every Wednesday he would take us to whatever he wanted to see. So I grew up on a steady diet of adult themed movies, and I totally absorbed it all. So I had this parallel track of really popular movies like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and all these. Jaws, my God, blew my mind because it was finally a convergence of a monster movie with popular appeal. Um, and I also had a track of things that scared me so much that I couldn't even sleep at night. And I was recently asked by some, I forget what it was, what was something Tony Timpone does.
Oh, Tony Timpone. Yeah, yeah, from
In
Fango. He's been on our
yeah,
show.
yeah, and Tony has a column like "What scarred you for life,"
Same kind of
and
thing. Yeah.
the movie that scarred me for life was a movie called The Shuttered Room, and it was Oliver Reed,
Hmm.
a British film, and I was a little kid, impressionable, but it was all about this dark, horrible thing in this crawl space or attic that was coming out and killing people. And it turns out to be a dark family secret. So when you're a child of divorce, you're always convinced your parents have this dark, horrible secret that's going to come get you at some point.
This
And
sounds so
Shuttered Room
familiar.
freaked me out. It absolutely scared the bejesus out of me, and I could not sleep at night. And it really registered for me, I think, because at that point I realized it wasn't the stuff that I loved, that I was Famous Monsters of Filmland, all that old
Uncle
Ford
Forey.
Ackerman stuff. I was like eating it up like breakfast cereal. I couldn't get enough of it. But when I hit this one horror movie that was actually based horror of real life ish, you know what I'm saying? In other words, the worst horror isn't what comes to you in the form of Frankenstein. What comes to you in the form of a human being and family, particularly at that point in my life. So that freaked me out. The Shuttered Room. I later found out that the movie was based on an H.P. Lovecraft story, posthumously. I said it terribly, but
That's
uh,
okay. We're from Kentucky.
ascribed to him and it was co-written by somebody else, but essentially an H.P. Lovecraft inspired story. And for me, that was at the time a little kid. I had no idea who H.P. Lovecraft was, so it wasn't like, oh my God, I'm an H.P. Lovecraft fan. No, I was just scared shitless of. I don't know if I can swear or not, but I'm scared to
You can say
death.
whatever the fuck you want.
Okay, I was scared shitless of this horrible story of this person that turns out to be a sibling, a crazy sibling of this woman. And when she goes back to fix her house up with her husband, this horrible monster from the past comes out and created the confluence, which we all wrestle with in horror, of course, is the confluence of sex and violence, right? It's
Right.
like the horrible scene where this couple is making love in a car, and then the horrible creature comes and kills them. You're like, oh my God, what was that? You're like devastated by this confluence of sex and violence. But that would be the genre movie that freaked me out. But in terms of the general influences, my God, Hitchcock was huge. I was fortunate enough to work with Joe Stefano, who wrote Psycho.
Oh yeah.
Uh, we worked together on The Kindred.
Hmm.
Wait, how do I do that? Oh, there.
There it
I've
is.
got this thing on reverse mirror. So yeah, The Kindred. And to meet him and to be able to work with one of your childhood heroes is always one of the benefits of this business. But Hitchcock was a huge influence, big influence. Spielberg and Jaws. Jaws blew my mind, changed everything for me. More importantly, I think Duel was, I don't know if you guys are
Oh, of
familiar with.
course, of
Oh,
course,
of
of
course.
course.
Okay. I don't know what level I'm.
Oh no,
I
no,
guess
no.
I should.
You, buddy, we had was it Stephen Mil who was the writer, James, who had the best Oliver Reed drinking story, got drunk with him. Was it Stephen Miller? Is that was his name? We had him on a year or two ago.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
will send you the link. You can feel free to fast forward it through all of it till he and Oliver Read in a
Oliver
hotel
Reed.
room. Yeah, so
Wow.
that's we when we dig deep, I'm
I
convinced
love
this is
it.
the reason why we don't have 6 million views is because we dig deep sometimes.
Oh, I love it. Anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, but
Absolutely answers my question.
okay.
My son's name is Quint.
Oh my God.
So
Oh,
yeah, I
Quint the Shark Killer.
we have the same
I
influences. Yeah,
love it.
yeah. When
I love it
I
to death.
you know, had in Richard Dreyfuss on the panel this past October, and I'll tell you later. Anyway,
That's amazing story. What an opportunity there.
oh, and
But
I expected him to be a curmudgeon. He wasn't. He was actually quite kind.
that's great. That's good to hear.
Yeah, it was.
Sometimes you don't want to necessarily meet your heroes.
It's absolutely true. So before we get going, I'm assuming because your parents sound fairly bohemian, the writers, I mean, were they supportive of you going into screenwriting and the movies, or would they have rather you became a vet?
No, like my daughter. Yeah. No, it was never, I mean, it's a weird thing because it was never, I never wanted to try to be a writer. And because of what I grew up with, I felt number one, I just felt it was not at all interesting to me, and movies and television were really interesting to me. And I didn't know, first of all, when I first started, that movies were written, so that became an after the fact kind of thing. And the fact is that Ray Bradbury was sort of an early mentor of mine because he wrote introductions to my mother's books. And uh, so I was trying to escape that whole, what I thought was a very stodgy, uninteresting world of short stories and novels. And I wanted to do something that was really cool, which were feature films and television, whatever. I didn't care.
Right.
And
Do you
my
mind if I
mother's,
talk, if you mind,
oh yeah,
Raylan Moore?
Raylan Moore, yes, exactly. And my stepfather, Ward Moore, who did Greener Than You Think. And
I just want for our audience to know who we were talking about.
oh, yeah, sorry,
Yeah, yeah,
Raylan Moore
yeah.
and Ward Moore, who wrote Bring the Jubilee and
Hmm.
Greener Than You Think, and won the uh, Nebula, which is a
Hmm.
science fiction award for something called Lot's Children or Lot's Daughter. He did two books based on that, two novellas based on that.
Yeah.
But anyway, so those are the people that sort of had this crushing weight on me. And I just wasn't interested. I said, I want to do everything but that. So, went to UCLA. My mother set up this lunch with Ray Bradbury and myself. We
That's
we
awesome, by the way.
chatted. He said, "So John, what do you want to do?" I said, "I want to write movies." And he said, "Well, if you want to write movies, if you want to be a writer, don't write movies." And I'm like, holy crap! I was like 18 years old, very impressionable. And he explained that there's so much between the audience and the writer in features and television because you've got the director, the actors, the production, everything is you're not connecting directly with your audience. And so I was kind of freaked out by that, but I took his advice. And I mean, I didn't take his advice. Ultimately, I kept writing screenplays on the side, fell into editing, um, got going as a screenwriter. 10 years later, to the year, he was shooting a movie with Isai Morales. I think it was the Ice Cream Man or something. I forget which one it was.
Hmm.
And I was shooting a movie
Is that
had
directed by
written.
Stuart Gordon?
Yes, it was. Good for you guys. God damn, you're good. Oh my
I
God.
No, don't get too excited.
Wow.
I
Okay.
just don't.
So
I've just been
I
doing this.
was.
I've just been doing this a minute or two.
Yeah. And so we were both in the same studio, and somebody said, "Oh, Ray's downstairs." And I go, "Oh my gosh!" So I went downstairs and I said, "Hey, how you doing?" And he goes, "Oh my gosh!" And he told the same stories over about my stepfather. They were roommates and
Hmm.
in Topanga Canyon. And it was a whole thing. And then, uh, you know, he had at the time, one of the things that he had sort of a bee in his bonnet about was John Huston. He felt that John Huston had screwed him on Moby Dick and had
Hmm.
taken credit for a screenplay he had nothing to do with, and he really hated directors really. And
That doesn't sound unusual at all for writers to be bitching about
well,
directors.
yeah, but
I'm
I was a
sorry. I'm sorry.
filmmaker.
We've just,
No, no,
if we've
no,
had a
it's
quarter for
true.
every time.
It's so true. But I always looked at myself as a filmmaker, not just a writer, you see.
Right.
So I felt like, yeah, I get it. But anyway, so he started railing against directors. And then my director, Joey Travolta,
Yep.
John's brother, comes up to me, and they happen to be friends, but I was like trying to, Ray, shut up. Here comes my director. And he and Joey knew each other, so they were reunion. Everything was cool and copacetic. And afterward, I said, 10 years ago, you told me something that kind of really fucked with me. And it was, if you want to be a writer, don't be a screenwriter. And he says, yeah, John, but screenwriting is so more relevant, isn't it? It's not. And I'm like, oh my God.
Don't listen to, he's Rad. So anyone else would have said, of course you listen to Ray Bradbury. He's fucking Ray
No.
Bradbury. But
So
if you'd have
here's
listened to him,
no, I never would have done. So here's the weird part is that I was going through a bunch of old stuff, and my daughter dug up the original letter from Ray Bradbury that my mother had written to him and said, "Can you please, give my, you know, meet my son and help him out?" And
yeah,
he wrote back this letter, and I have a copy framed now that says, "I'd be happy to meet your son and give him terrible advice. So have him call me at this phone number." And I thought, well, in a very joking way, very Ray Bradbury way. And I thought, oh my God, he was maybe not fooling around. He was actually giving me bad advice. But I often talk to people who ask advice from me now. I
yeah,
said, consider the source. For Ray Bradbury, short stories and novels, that was the thing, right? For my parents, novels and short stories, that was film of their day. That was television of their day. And you have to kind of keep that in mind when somebody's giving you advice. You have to say, okay, that's how you came up, but that's not the world I'm in now. So that was my big lesson from Ray Bradbury. Weirdly, not the lesson I think he set out to give me.
no, that's a fantastic story. And I think James, I don't think we've ever had anybody else on the show who had a Ray Bradbury story in 300
No,
episodes, have we?
no. Well, we have talked about Ray Bradbury indirectly and
Indirectly, but
and
we
directly talking about his works, but I don't think we've ever had anybody talk about conversations with
Well,
Bradbury.
he
So
was a great guy, and I mean a great talent, I should say. And I'll be candid. I know he's dead now, but he was a bit of a, I don't want to say racist, but he was not somebody my mother was thrilled to hang out with later in life, because he bluntly, he was like, you get together and say the Mexicans are taking over LA, and you're like, oh, okay. Yeah. But a different generation, different time, xenophobic. I know we talk about H.P. Lovecraft now with this filter. Ray was part of that generation. Well, no, I mean a later generation, but
one right
still,
after him. He's really just
yeah,
the actual next generation
that's
right after
correct.
Lovecraft.
And
Lovecraft
and
and
yeah, so for me, I have to separate who I knew as the person with the work, which was
the artist from the art.
incredible, absolutely phenomenal. But yeah, nice guy, super friendly, great sense of humor, way helpful, unless you took his advice.
But
And then,
clearly, I was rewatching The Kindred yesterday while I should have been working.
oh
And
no,
it's okay. It's okay.
I apologize that you
No,
put yourself through that again.
no. Well, because the movie's, if you don't mind me saying, and I'm jumping a little bit here. I wanted to talk a little bit about your editing, but you edited on that movie too, right?
I did. What's weird about the Kindred is always um, one of those experiences that was so defining in so many ways. I was just up in Portland doing that Q&A and presented Return of the Living Dead 3,
Mm-hmm.
and they had Steelbook Blu-rays that I signed of it. So it definitely was a creature movie that some people at a certain point in their life loved because we had no CGI and all that. But
Yeah.
what was interesting about that movie was being a writer and an editor, because as a writer, it taught me more about screenwriting than any other experience I've ever had. Writing, you just can't get that because you're not writing for the page, you're writing for the screen. And as much as I try to tell my students there's a huge difference, you can only write what you see and hear. I was guilty in that first script of saying, well, what happened to this idea? When I'm looking at the footage, it's not there. And you realize some of the things you think as a screenwriter will convey don't. And that was the biggest lesson and made me a better writer, was that experience of having to write something and then try to clean up the mess and fix and retell the story for the final time on film. Really gave me the perspective that I think was the most valuable in terms of understanding screenwriting, was doing those two jobs. And it is unusual, right?
It's an unusual film, but it's clearly got Lovecraft all over it.
It does. But also, now think about something.
And a stacked cast. We'll get to that in a second.
And it has shuttered room over.
Yep. That's
when
you were telling me that
it's a sibling that's in the basement. And I look back and I go, oh my God, that's shuttered room. That's the thing that terrified me as a kid, was the unknown sibling. In this case, it's a real creature that is killing people.
Yeah. So when did you come on in the process? There's there 3 or 5 writers on that were listed?
There's a lot. There's a boatload. What happened was, on the Kindred, I had done, the first credit I have is something called The Power. And that was a story by credit. And that movie,
which has also been riffed by Mystery Science Theater 3000.
Oh, good.
Did you know that?
No.
You didn't know it?
But it deserves it, I'm sure.
Well, that was one that I didn't track down. I was going to ask James because we didn't have a chance before this. He's a big MSTK fan, and I was going to ask him, and we didn't get a chance to talk before the interview because of kids and work and whatnot. Did you see this and did you see that? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No worries. No, The Power was the first credit on screen that I had as a writer, story by.
Yeah.
And lots of issues that I had. It is what it is, but it teed me up with a group of filmmakers that we were from UCLA. We did The Dorm That Dripped Blood, which was also called Pranks Overseas, which was a British, what was it called? Nasty. The Video Nasty.
Video Nasty. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So later, I was proud of that, but at the time you were devastated by it. But
yeah, because in the 80s, Bruce Campbell, we've talked about this before, Bruce Campbell said it many times, Ash from the Evil Dead has said, in the 80s, especially early 80s, doing horror, like here was porn.
Yeah.
And here was horror.
Exactly. Barely that far above. But
some of the grips are doing both sets.
Exactly. That's true. Literally true.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I had been involved with this group of filmmakers, Jeff Obrow, Steve Carpenter, and we did Dorm Drip Blood. I was an assistant editor on, and I literally walked from my last class at UCLA right to the editing room with no break, and did sound effects on that. And then with that same group, we just all hung together. I did a story credit from The Power, and then with the Kindred, it was a little more formalized because it was an idea that Jeff Obrow was sort of throwing around. And then my roommate at the time, Earl, who was the co-editor with me, started bouncing it around. And we went in and pitched to Jeffrey Obrow this whole long-winded, horrible mess of a story. And he says, yeah, okay, why don't you guys, I'm going to bring in Steve Carpenter now. And you 3 can work on this. And so then that became the core. It was Steve Carpenter, myself, and Earl that generated the first draft of the script. Jeff Obrow came in, worked on it some. We sort of wrote the script on a dictaphone. I like to say that Earl and I were such huge Jaws fans that we looked at Jaws and we kept trying to steal things like when that dog dies in Kindred, it's like Pippet,
Yeah.
Pippet,
Yep.
where's Pippet?
Yeah.
That was our Pippet, was the dog dying, and then we built from there and we kept imitating Jaws. But for me, of course, I look. What was interesting for me about the Kindred was that literally the odd, creepy, related monster in the basement, based on my horror from the Shuttered Room. That was sort of what drove my interest in that story. So we all worked on that script together, had a lot of fun, and got it to a point where Feldman Meeker Company was interested in it and made the project go.
Yeah.
Then Joe Stefano was sort of brought in for frosting. Much later, he came in and kind of did a pass, but there were some things that we rejected from, well, I didn't, but Jeff Obrow rejected from what Joe had done. And nevertheless, I think Joe did enough. He did what he could with it. Let's put it that way. And then he became, as an editor, he would show up and he would hang out in the editing room. And that was a real treat because one of the things Joe Stefano sort of made me feel so excited about being in this industry was, here's the guy who frickin' wrote Psycho.
Mm-hmm.
And he's sitting next to me at an editing bench and he's watching footage and he goes, oh my God, this is like Christmas morning, isn't it, John? And I go, what do you, and he says, we wrote this and now look, it's there. It's like Christmas morning. It's like seeing the packages under the tree. And his enthusiasm
That's amazing.
for what we do was so contagious. I said, oh my God, I want to be Joe Stefano at his age. I mean, the guy who wrote Psycho was still excited about the art form and loved being there and loved the fact that we were taking time and showing him scenes from the Kindred. And it was just so magical and wonderful. And that experience was so great. Just really loved it. But so many people I know from my life have worked on that movie, and we all have kept in touch. We're all, I married the set nurse, for God's sakes. She's my wife. Vowed never to be the set nurse again after she did a Hart Bochner movie.
Yeah.
Hart Bochner did, he was the annoying yuppie in Die Hard. I don't know if you know this guy or not.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I don't know
Well,
how
a little
weird
bit. I mean, I know who you're talking about.
Okay. But anyway, so we were all very connected from the Kindred, and it was a real important thing. It was after that movie that I left aside editing and I transitioned into a full-time screenwriter.
But two things, and I know James has a question, but before I turn it over, two things. One, you it's pretty cool that you're, I wouldn't say lucky because I don't know that I believe too much in luck, but there is a little bit of luck in life. But
Oh, there is.
you walked right out of class and right into jobs.
I did. It's funny because at UCLA, I was just that geek who would do anything. I just wanted to be involved in film so much. And I have a good friend, Jeffrey Sherman, who I'm going to do his podcast, ironically.
Mm-hmm.
Jeffrey Sherman was one of the showrunners and writers of Boy Meets World.
Yeah.
And at the time, he was the first student film I ever worked at UCLA. And I just volunteered. I was an English major at UCLA, and I studied critical studies. I took every critical studies class I could take and lapped it up. I started volunteering on student films, and Jeff Sherman, and he always said, John, I became very good friends. He says, you were just willing to do anything just to be part of it all. And I think that's probably where it comes from. I don't know if it was luck or not, but it's just, hey, I'll do whatever you need. I just want to be involved. I'll do anything. And when Jeff Obrow was doing a feature, I said, you need a sound effects editor? I'll do it. Absolutely.
No, it
I say
makes
yes to
sense.
everything.
Before we move off of the kindred, because this
Yeah,
is something not only is Lovecraft throughout a lot of some of your work, a lot of influences, and that's,
definitely.
but you have a lot of movies with stacked casts, I would say.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
And the
Um,
kindred, I'm just, so people ask me a question. They'll ask me, "Oh, behind the scenes, who's an asshole?" and blah 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 blah. And I go, "Well, I like to keep my job, so I don't usually say."
right, of
And at
course.
least I don't say in interviews and stuff. But I was curious. I can't help but not ask Steiger, which one did you get?
Well, it's a great story, actually. And it's
Good.
funny. No one asked this story, but my wife was a set nurse.
No one asked about Rod Steiger?
No, no, I mean, I haven't
Nerds.
since. Yeah. William Hurt's another story. We'll get to him. But Rod Steiger, his wife was younger, would show up with a literal medicine cat box that had airline size alcohol in it. Now, by the time we were working with Steiger, he was, 3 sheets to the wind and would show up, but he needed it to kind of level the playing field. So we had a steady hand. And that was just the way it was. It was like, okay, no, he needs to have his drinks and so forth and so on. But what Steiger loved to do was he would test you, and he would always do things with a slight smile. It was a kind of a weird side. One side of his mouth would kind of tilt up in a smile. And one of the things he did to sort of quote unquote torture us was he said, I want doers, but it has to be in airline size bottles. And so we sent a production assistant out to find it and spent all day and was horrified. Why does a sheet come back and says, I can't find it anywhere? And then Steiger said, yeah, they don't make it in airline bottles. and and so we go, okay, so you like to fuck with people. So the famous story is, in our family, the famous story is he would always come off and he would always challenge you initially. So somebody told my wife, the set nurse, now Rod Steiger has an upset stomach or something, so go see him. So she goes up and totally uh, intimidated by this guy because he had a very commanding, intimidating presence. Um, and she kind of clamped up and she couldn't remember what his name was. And so she just looked at his character name. She goes, Dr. Lloyd, can I help you with anything? And there was a moment where it could have gone either way. And then that slight smile came over Steiger. And he and my wife became great compadres. He called her Doc. And it turns out that he ended up liking my wife, but it was always about, you know, would you stand up to him or would you cave to him? And if you cave to him, forget about it. But if you stood your ground and you were, I'm this person and I'm going to ask you and I'm not going to cave, then he got over that and he was a very charming guy. And he used to tell the story of the kindred is a campfire story. He used to say, we're here doing a movie that's a ghost story that you tell around a campfire. And he was totally cool. And the day we had to pour, because the way that movie happened, we were at Laird Studios, which is now Culver Studios.
Mm-hmm.
And we were on stage 3 where they shot E.T., weirdly enough. And we had that stage because there was a pit, because we had that whole scene in The Kindred where people fall down into this basement. We built that whole house on that set, interior, exterior, right there. And at the climax of The Kindred, this massive amounts of methacellulose had to pour all over Steiger. And everyone's a little nervous, of course, but he was like, bring it on, pour it, pour it. He was all in at that point. And the fact that he committed to that B horror movie always kind of warmed my heart. I thought he was great. But we made that movie all together. The editing room was right there. The stage was right there. The production offices were right there. It was a real studio bound movie. And so being part of it all was like one big family. And it was a great experience. And I think at the end of the day, I only have great things to say about him. What he was in on it. He committed. I like to say the dialogue was very stiff on the page, but Steiger, being the brilliant actor that he was, played it like a jazz musician. He weaved in and out of the dialogue and then came in and landed right where the next actor needed to pick up. He was that amazing a talent. He was amazing.
I mean, it was just a stacked cast with him and Kim Hunter, but it just.
Oh, Kim Hunter, yes. Are you kidding me? Planet of the Apes, one of my amazing. I should have mentioned that earlier. Planet of the Apes is incredibly important to me. And the day that Rod Steiger and Kim Hunter were in a scene together in the hospital, every press in LA showed up. They were it was a big deal because they'd never performed together, and they were part of Actors Studio. They were both from that Brando world, the Stella Adler bit. And to have both of those actors together on one stage was big news, and we got a lot of press that day.
I don't know that I realized that when I was watching it, but yeah, I got to turn it over to James and let him ask a question.
Sorry, James.
Oh, no,
That's okay.
this is
as you can tell, I talk a lot.
That's
which is exactly what we want.
That's what we want. We want good stories.
I'm going to be that guy that all of a sudden switches gears, though, because as I was doing research, you have, unless my date is wrong, written outside of film as well.
Yes.
You've written a couple novels.
I did.
So one of the things I wanted to ask is, what's that transition like? As you think about what's writing a novel, how does that feel differently than writing a screenplay?
Huge differences, and and yes, of course. What happened was, I again grew up around writers. The last thing I ever wanted to do was be a novelist or short story writers. I came around later during the explosion of ebooks. My friend Steve Carpenter, who created Grimm and I had written a bunch of stuff with, made like $250,000 on ebooks when it first started. And he says, John, you got to knock a novel out. You can do this. Just do it.
So just like go home and rub one out.
Yeah, exactly. So I took a screenplay, Truck Stop, and I did it. And it did really well when in the early era of Kindle. It just, you could give it away and it would ride to the top of horror, and then you shut off the freebies and it would still be there, and then you're getting paid as it slowly drifted down. And I did really well on that first novel, and I said, wow, this is fantastic. So one of the things I realized later that made it a success was, you can do these keyword searches. I had Stephen King in my search words, and it did really well. I did my second novel, Killing Time. The first one was Truck Stop. The second one was Killing Time, and I used Stephen King as a keyword. I got this horrible notice from Amazon, said if you cannot use another author in your key search. If you do that again, you'll be banished from Amazon forever. So I took it out. That second book did about half as good as the first one. But anyway, that's sort of how I got into the novels, was through Steve Carpenter. The experience of writing them was totally eye-opening. It was, wow, I can convey thoughts. I can convey things that you can't see or hear. I can convey emotion and nuance, and I can digress, and it's like was being let into a playground where I could take what was my script as the spine of the story, and I could just flesh it out in ways that you only dream of doing in a feature film. So this is, of course, streaming is a different beast, but when you're doing long form series, the goal of television is to keep people watching. The goal of feature film is to deliver a peak experience in 2 hours. And so they're very different forms, and the expectations are different. The expectations of reading a novel are very different. So for me, it was a great experience, and that's why I did two more after that. I did Killing Time, and then I did my recent one called It Comes Back, which is out. So I started doing that self-publishing thing, and then I kind of like, well, I'm too busy doing movies. I'm not going to continue with it. And then this company, Encyclopocalypse Publications, a guy named um, Mark A. Miller, not Mark Miller, used to run Clive Barker's publishing entity, and he started a publishing company called Encyclopocalypse, and so all my books are with them now. And so they convinced me to do the third novel, It Comes Back, and then I have another one in the wings. So we'll see.
I'm embarrassed to say if I would have known, because I was reading the summary of Truck Stop.
Yeah.
And I travel for work, so
oh geez,
I have been at some truck stops.
Yeah.
It's not for work though. That's for pleasure.
Listen,
He's lying.
Anyway, no. But as I was reading the summary, I was like, oh, yeah, I'm gonna have to get my hands on this book. So because I was just reading the summary, and if I get the summary wrong, but you're the outline, at first I was like, oh, is it one of the, you pick up a hitchhiker on the road and it's that classic trope. And then as I was reading the summary, I'm like, wait a second. It almost seems like the tortured souls, the spirits, the ghosts, whatever, are helpful, but they're just tortured.
They want to be, yes, they want the killer to be found. And the real driving force now, after, well, I'll circle back at some point, but I through the 90s, I wrote a lot of two-handers, which would have like a William Hurt and a Peter Weller, and I did a lot of action adventure movies for Friday night HBO premiere and then theatrical around the world. But what I always understood about that was I needed a central drive. And one of the things that I didn't want to learn from my father, my blood father, who was in journalism, kept always saying to me, story is character and character is story. And for me, it was always wax on, wax off. I didn't understand that. And when it finally dawned on me was when I was in a screening Friday night with The Power and people were walking out, I realized, oh my God, I now know what my father was saying, is you need the character, the character to drive the story. And in Truck Stop, the characters, I went for the strongest drive I could find, which was, I need to find my daughter. My daughter has gone missing. And that emotional tug was from a real world experience where my daughter wandered out of a restaurant at one point in a busy street, and that horror drove what Truck Stop was, which was this guy's daughter goes missing in a truck stop where there's a serial killer circulating, and my protagonist can see the dead. And that's really what it was for me, what glues people to those pages. It's a page turner. And I designed it to be the kind of novel that you pick up before you go on a long flight and you just want something to hold your attention. And it was about that central emotional drive. My God, as a parent, you guys know what it's like, right? If your child goes out of sight.
Saying that, actually, there was several years ago when she was much younger. She's still young, but she was much younger. We went to an event that was local, Kite Fest, and they have, people bringing all these kites of all different types, and it's cool because they're on the air. And we took my daughter, and it sounds like a throwaway line you'd hear on the news, but literally we were all looking up. She was right next to me, and then she was gone.
Horrendous.
And
it happens to all of us.
It was at a park, and the park had lakes on it. And I was like, and immediately, I won't speak for everybody. I don't know if it's a common dad thing, but my mind went, she's drowned. I don't know. I don't know which direction to go in. I don't know, and there's a crowd, and I can't see to find her. And
Yeah.
so yeah, so now you made me want to read it that much more, because
Well,
you're
that's what the
absolutely right.
central drive is. It was what my father always said: character is story, and story is character. If you have the character that's that want, whatever that want of what the character wants, what's the objective, that defines the story. And for me, I always start, or try to start, from a place of emotional truth. In other words, an experience that I had, that you guys have had, that is literal real life horror. And so the metaphor surrounding it is all great, and opens it up, and people are interested and all that. But that emotional journey, that pull, is what really Truck Stop's about for me. And of course, you have all the good fun stuff of the apparitions, and oh, a black cat. Oh my God.
We have two, and this is the
Oh my
one who's
God.
unfriendly. Her name is Pickles,
Oh
and
no.
Pickles won't shut the fuck up because I'm doing an interview. Now, Pickles hasn't been down here to bother me in the last 5 different episodes that we
I
have
love
not
pickles.
had guests. Yes, Pickles. Yes, yes. Anyway,
Hilarious. But yeah, Truck Stop. And that same idea carried me through the 90s when I was writing all those movies. I knew that I needed to give not one but two characters in my films a real strong emotional pull, a drive. And that's why we were able to cast big names in two parts.
so the movie I'm assuming you get asked about the most is Return of the Living Dead 3. I'm making
Yeah,
an assumption.
sure.
And it's weird. Shh, Pickles. It's weird to me because Mindy Clark, was at
Yeah.
Scarefest, which is actually the second or third biggest horror conventions actually in Lexington, Kentucky, and I'm do the panels.
Wow.
And I didn't get to do a we she just had 100 guests and she didn't make the panel list. And I didn't get a chance to really talk to her and meet her. But it is so, and I know you get this from men, I'm assuming, maybe a lot of women at a certain age, but it's so weird to have a crush on behind your head. And a crush is the best way that's the most PG way I'm going to put it. I don't have a daughter, but my two best friends have daughters. You have daughters. Everybody's somebody's daughter. But it is weird, right? Why am I so,
Well, you're not alone.
let's use the word attracted to this visage, if you will, this
Yeah.
visual.
Where is she? She's right there behind me. There
Yeah,
she is.
she's right
And I
there.
have a better one. Here's the one that'll really, oh, here, she's right here.
Oh yeah.
This is the one that they did later, which is Julie in all her glory, with the
Yep.
naked breasts and everything,
Yep.
very curvy in this one. This really leans into um, your question there. But what was interesting about that is, yes, 100% it was calculated. Um,
I've been in the room with Brian. I've never got to
oh,
interview him,
okay.
but he's a businessman.
He is. But no, what was interesting about that, so after the Kindred, I entered something called Development Hell in Hollywood. And I sold a script to Warner Brothers, and I did a bunch of screenwriting jobs.
Yes.
And I always naively thought, well, I'm gonna end up making this movie that I'm working on. And nothing ever came to fruition. But they paid you really well.
That
I
was
mean,
in the days when they would pay for development, correct?
yes, there was a
You could
lot of money out there.
you
You
could
sold
make
the
a lot, you could
script.
make a whole living. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but for the audience listening, we've had a lot of screenwriters on before. There is times, especially in the 90s, 80s, that you could make a living and never make a damn movie.
I
And you
know
make
writers
a
that have
hell of a good
never,
living.
yeah, never made a movie, but did really well. And so I entered that. I was lucky enough to enter that world, and did movies at Orion and Warner Brothers and a bunch of stuff. And I realized, I came from the Kindred where we actually made the freaking movie that we wrote, and I got kind of frustrated. And so when my manager called me and said, "Oh, they're looking for a pitch for Return of the Living Dead sequel," I said, "Well, I was an assistant editor on the first one. of course I have to be the one who gets this job. I was convinced I was going to get this job
And I'm going to ask
for
you a
no
Dan
real good
O'Bannon
reason.
question as soon as we're done with this.
Yeah, yeah. So, so I went in. I came up with this. I recently lost my father,
I'm
and
sorry.
the pain of having to let go of somebody you love was, again, I always look for that emotional drive. The pain of having to let go of somebody you love was what drove Return 3. And I came in and I pitched it, and Brian responded to that idea because he thought sort of the same thing, which is let's personify a zombie of some kind. And that was one of the amazing things that Dan O'Bannon created in the original Return, was that you, for the first time, you have that zombie perspective on the material. And so for me, it was like, okay, I'm going to do Sid and Nancy, Romeo and Juliet, whatever it is. She's dead. He can't deal with the fact of letting her go, and it ultimately brings him down. And that was the drive. I pitched it, went in, got the gig, and then started developing it from there. So that's kind of how Return 3 happened. You said you had a question. I don't know. I don't
Well,
want
it
to
was
get too
just
far ahead.
go ahead, James.
Well, I was going to say, which is funny though, because in some ways you've almost created what's now become a trope,
Yep.
right? Because there's warm
Thank you.
bodies, life after death, and
Right.
it's become this idea of what you could even argue, you know, I don't know, my boyfriend's back. All these
Lisa
different,
Frankenstein, they all should write you a check.
because
Well, this is the thing. I try to tell people that. I said, no, warm bodies happened after I had done this idea. No, 100%. And thank you for recognizing that. I appreciate that. There's also another weird thing that borrowed heavily from Return 3, which was Resident Evil.
Yes.
If you look at the Resident Evil video game, a guy named Jackson Stewart, who did this movie with Barbara Crampton in it, Beyond the Gates. I don't know if you know this movie or not. It was a little quirky movie a few years ago.
Is
And
that the VHS one where the
yes, yeah,
with the tape, and
VHS
she's
tape.
on the VHS tape? Yeah,
Yes.
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you're good. Jackson sent me this sequence of clips from the original Resident Evil game, and the entire sequence at the opening of Return 3 is in the freaking video game. And then I'm going, so they borrowed a lot of that industrial military complex angle in Resident Evil, and that underground fort. All that stuff was sort of inspired, I want to say, by Return 3, as well as Warm Bodies and all that crap that came after it. Not that it's not, I didn't like Warm Bodies, I got to be honest, but
I didn't either.
I'm just, of course I can afford to say that because I feel like I did a better version of that idea. But you're absolutely right. This Return 3, what sparked me for Return 3 was when I was on the set for that. Our editing room was next to the sound stages. So everyone hung out together. We all ate lunch together. And the day they were shooting the half corpse on the autopsy table, where her spinal cord is waving back and forth and fluid is leaking out, it blew my fucking mind when they're saying, talked, and it talked, and it said, I'm in pain, dying is painful. I said, holy shit, I've never seen this before. Dan O'Bannon is a genius. He cracked this. And so that was what I took, and then took it to the next level, because in Return, the original one, they start seizing up with rigor mortis. And I thought, that's my template. I'm going to take a young woman who's been infected, is going to be slowly dying, going through these agonizing steps of death based on what the original Return was. And then this guy can't let go of her. That's the tragedy of the whole thing. Yeah.
So, like I said, we wanted to try to go at a different angle because I know you get a ton of the Return of the Living Dead. So hopefully we went at a little angle different than that. But I don't know that I realized that you were I don't know that I have it in my notes, and I'm so sorry. What is your best? Because I've met almost the whole cast. I've interviewed almost the whole cast. I did a huge panel 2 years ago at Scare Fest with them. What's your best batshit Dan O'Bannon story?
Well, okay, so I was in the
Because a
editing
lot of people have a lot of
era.
batshit Dan O'Bannon stories,
Yes,
and
he was a
he wrote a lot
character.
of stuff I like.
Yeah, no, he was batshit crazy. But what there was two weird things that would happen to us in the editing room. One, Bob Gordon, the editor. Now, I was a second assistant, so I had to sync up dailies every morning. So I had plenty to do in the morning. I was busy syncing up the dailies and looking at it and scratching our head saying he has no coverage. How is he going to? He had no coverage of the split dog shot. There's no close-ups. There's nothing to cut to. And we're like, does this guy know what he's doing? We were very perplexed by the whole thing. And during right after lunch, the last like 15 minutes of lunch, he would come into the editing room. Now he was hypoglycemic. So he always had to be eating. So he'd always have a sandwich. He'd slam it down on the editing console and he'd tell um, Bob Gordon, cut here with a wax thing. And then he'd go back to the set. And Bob wasn't like open to keep cutting. Traditionally, the editor will keep cutting on their own, and then you get feedback from the editor and you shape it. Dan wouldn't let us cut ahead of ahead of camera, and which cutting up to camera means that you're cutting the movie as you're shooting it, and you're up to camera meaning it's shooting. Whatever you did yesterday will be roughed in so that you go forward. You can see how your movie's taking shape. Dan wanted nothing of that. So what we would do was after lunch, Bob would open up the bar and he would make us martinis. And so we would sit there in the afternoon and sip martinis until dailies time, where we would go watch the dailies that I had sunk up in the morning. And it was because he wouldn't let them cut like normal directors would do. And so for us, I was having a blast because that afternoon I'd have a martini, I'd go watch them shoot. You know, that's where I wandered onto the set many times.
And you were getting an education.
I was learning, I was soaking it up, of
Yeah.
course. And like I said, I got to see the half corpse scene at that point.
That's
Yeah,
fantastic.
Dan was a character, very interesting character.
I feel like there's another story you just don't want to tell.
No, because the truth be told, I left after production. I moved to another movie, Girls Just Want to Have Fun.
Yeah.
Sarah Jessica Parker, Helen Hunt. It was and it was my chance. I got a promotion. I was first assistant. I was like cutting scenes, and that was my big break. Was Girls Just Want to Have Fun.
Yeah.
I didn't catch that you worked on that. Oddly enough, I have a friend. That's her favorite film. Like it's her favorite comfort film. She
As
goes
it should
back
be.
to because she caught it when she was younger, and she goes, "It's just it." She goes, "There's no stress in that movie for me. It's just
It
something I
is.
can watch."
I agree. And I had so much fun working on that movie. Another case where I was working with David Rawlins, who cut Saturday Night Fever. And that was a dance movie. And I had the awesome opportunity to learn from him about cutting musicals. Now, I have a whole story about that. I don't want to digress, but it was a pretty crazy story.
Do it.
Oh, so
we're getting right at the hour time. So I just want to let you know
shit.
what guests are getting here.
I don't know how long your show goes, but let me just tell you this.
We can go forever. It's actually about you. So tell this story. I've got to hear it.
So we're editing this big dance sequence, the big dance off at the end of Girls Just Want to Have Fun. You know, it's a big outdoor competition.
Now this one I haven't seen.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
So sorry, John.
Helen Hunt and Shannon Doherty's in it, and the star was Sarah Jessica Parker, who gave me a life lesson as an artist during lunch one day. Anyway,
what was the life lesson?
Oh, the life lesson, we were all sitting there having lunch and we were talking about the business side of being a creative in the industry. And I said, yeah, I can't deal with that. She says, you have to deal with it. You've got to take responsibility and be aware to the business side because they'll screw you all if you don't. And I said, wow, okay, Thank you
And
for that. I took
she
that to
hadn't
heart.
she hadn't been in the business too long then, had she? I mean, she
She had
was,
been in Square Pegs, which was a
yeah.
TV show.
Hmm.
I mean,
Yeah,
that was one of the earlier. Was that her
yeah,
first film
yeah.
outside
I
of
believe
No,
it was
television?
her
That's
well,
first.
very
no, hold
early.
on. She would have been in Flash. No, she was in Footloose before that too, right?
I think she had a small part in Footloose, which
She
made
wasn't.
her
She,
get
yeah.
the starring role opposite Helen Hunt in this movie.
Sorry,
But
didn't mean to
anyway,
interrupt you. Yes.
no, no, no. The weird story about editing that movie is that David Rawlins, I said, so tell me about cutting Saturday Night Fever. He says, well, I just looked for Otis or whatever his name was, the choreographer. I go, what do you mean? He said, because we only had temp tracks for Saturday Night Fever. We didn't have any of the finished Bee Gee music. We just had something in which they put down basic rhythms and
Hmm.
they would send those to set. And so the way I cut Saturday Night Fever was I just looked for the choreographer was always in the crowd somewhere, and he would be clapping to the beat so people could dance to it. And he said, I only made my cuts when I saw his hands close so I could go to the next one. And I knew that's how I stayed. And
Oh,
I'm
that's
like,
cool.
what? This is like, huh? And sure enough, that's how he put together Saturday Night Fever was he would look for the choreographer clapping his hands so he knew he was cutting on beat for every new angle. Small, weird anecdote. I don't know if anybody cares, but
We
I found
do.
That is
I found it
fascinating.
really odd.
We've made several short films and are failed filmmakers ourselves, and we know what you're talking about.
I was
So
about to say,
the other missing bonehead is Chad, who edited everything that we've ever done,
Oh
and
wow.
he is going to kick himself in the dick later when he's listening to this about.
Well, I got to work. I mean, like I say, Bob Gordon on Return was
Hmm.
amazing. David Rawlings, amazing. Richard Halsey was a huge influence. I mean, all those guys were big name editors from an era in which we were cutting celluloid.
Yeah, we had Paul Hirsch on the show actually
Oh,
a
well, there
couple
you
years
go.
ago when he had his book. Yeah, it was one of those feather in the cap that he actually did it. But anyway, I've taken an hour of your time. I know you said an hour. I got a couple of questions. Is it okay if we do a
Yes.
couple more?
Yeah, no, you can keep going. It's not a problem.
Okay. Okay. Well, I don't
Yeah.
want to keep you too long. James, do
Okay.
you mind if I go? Because
go, go, go.
I'm going to try to phrase this. No, I'm just going to ask. Who was the biggest pain in the ass? Because you have some legendary pains in the asses in some of your movies.
Uh,
And
uh,
no,
uh,
and I'm going to give you some names, and you don't necessarily. Who was? Let's try to think of how to put this. Tom Sizemore, Katherine Heigl, or William Hurt.
um, okay. Each one was a different case.
Okay.
Sizemore was using drugs. So I felt that it was for me a struggle just to get usable material because I would roll on my close-ups. By the way, I want to throw out a plug here. Can I please? Uh,
Please.
Zizek's Road, the special edition, is coming out. Brian Usen and I have a new company called Dark Arts
It's
Entertainment.
here. I was going to
Oh,
bring
you
it
got
up.
that. Okay, I'm jumping ahead.
Because no. It's I just
Oh,
wanted to
please
let
go.
you know I wrote it down because you guys announced it on social media this week.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. But anyway, so let's talk. Tom Sizemore was a challenge, but it was a chemical challenge. In other words, he was like a Steiger who would play in the moment and would riff, but I had to get certain lines down. So I would roll massive amounts of material and I would just make sure I got the pieces I need. So he was a challenge in a different way. Katherine Heigl was the easiest person you could possibly have worked for. She had just come off, I know, she had just come off a TV show called something, I forget. It was on like the CW. It was a genre show.
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys remember it or not. But anyway,
No, I don't remember. I don't know what she was in.
yeah,
I
this was right before she did Grey's Anatomy.
right.
And part of what her agenda was to show how easy you could work with her. I was told later. I could not have made Zizek's Road without her uh, doing the great job that she did. She was totally professional, totally prepared, never complained, hit her mark, did her material, and was so effortlessly a perfect person to work with. William Hurt I did 2 movies with. The first one I wrote and produced, called Contaminated Man,
Directed by
with
the
Peter,
great Tony Hickox.
Tony Hickox and Peter Weller was in that movie, and Natasha McElhone.
Yeah.
And I was a writer producer on that movie. And so when I went to the set, William and I hit it off really well, and we got very friendly and met his sons, and it was a very great situation because I wasn't directing him. I was sort of an ally, right?
Yeah.
And then the second movie I worked with him on was the movie I directed, called Hellgate, with Cary Elwes and William Hurt. And it was a very different experience directing him. He was a very complicated person. And I felt his pain, but I feel that, you know, it was difficult, but I kept trying to keep my mind on the goal, which is when William Hurt tells you the rules of some crazy thing, like in Altered States, you believe him. And I witnessed pure genius as an actor. He was amazing, but super. It was a difficult relationship, and it was very strained for us during that movie.
Do you mind if I probe a little bit on that? What I
Sure.
would like to ask is it his process of understanding the character and the material? Is it
No.
his too many questions, or is he
Nope.
just being a dick?
No, neither, none. He understood the character. He understood the world. He understood his place in his part in the movie, and he understood the overall of the movie, which is a rare thing you get in actors. So they can understand, in this given scene, I have to do this, this, and this, so I carry the movie to the next scene. But I also have to be in the moment and play every moment for emotional truth. The guy was a genius. He was very high strung. He was at a pitch in which he was super intelligent, a very intelligent guy, and overly perceptive, and would see things a mile before you could see them. And when you're dealing with somebody like that, he may be reacting to something he sees coming. And I'm like in the moment, not understanding what he's upset about. So it was never difficult. It was never about being, it was difficult, but it was never about not being prepared. He was ultra prepared and very, very, very big talent, a huge talent. But it was because of that intelligence level that he saw things that, because he'd done this so much and was thinking of things in a dimensional way that you weren't, that he would call into question or challenge or be aware of things that you weren't worrying about at that point. But never, and I have a soft spot for him because it's as contentious as it got between us and as difficult as it was at times. At the end of the day, you know, he reached out to me, and we did because we'd done 2 movies together, and I felt more than just some actor I had hired, you know, and I really have a soft spot for him and his troubled world that he comes from. This you know, I hate to be cliche, but
No, please.
somebody who's that heightened and so smart about what they're doing, it brings with it an anticipation of issues that don't seem to be right there in front of you. You follow what I'm saying? It's like, you know, this and then Brian Usena said something later that was interesting. He said, oh yeah, it's because he looked around and he said, I'm the biggest name in this movie. And so insecurity starts to creep in. And that may have been part of the motivation of questioning, you know what I mean? Questioning things.
Right.
But who knows?
Yeah.
But yes, in answer to those 3, Heigl, amazing. Sizemore, drug-induced issues. Hurt, too smart for his own good.
But by the way, just apropos of nothing, but the Katherine Heigl was coming off of Roswell, which I remember, but I failed to make that connection.
I
It was
didn't
coming off of
remember. I
Roswell.
couldn't remember.
That was it. You got it. It was Roswell. Yeah.
I pulled Stuart Gordon out of my ass earlier about Ice Cream Man, but I
That
totally
was
did.
good.
I totally.
I could keep going. We only got to a few movies, but what you had one more, and then
Yeah, yeah, and then I know you've got to go. So, well, really, it was more of I just kind of wanted to wrap up, but there was two of you got to work. You worked. Nick Mancuso was in a lot of your movies.
he was, yes. Nick, again, I have so many stories about Nick, but time is short. Nick was my antagonist in multiple movies.
Hmm.
And I spent a lot of time with Nick Mancuso. And we tried to find the essence of his character in many different ways. The first time it was based sort of on my stepfather, and I told him this story as we walked through the park in Vancouver, and
Hmm.
he was able to grab. Another time, true story. Do you know what chi is when you roll these dice out and you read these? Um,
Pretend I
it
don't.
was this
I'm
Asian
right.
thing where you roll these things and then you read these bones or whatever they
Hmm.
are to get clues. And I remember sitting in a trailer with him once, and he decided he was going to help open the character by trying these different things. And of course, I'm there going, I'm not sure about this, Nick. Super smart guy, super creative. I love him to death. But that was one of the weird, quirky moments but I've had a series of them. Daniel Baldwin, you didn't bring up.
I, there's a whole list. I could be here forever.
Oh yeah. And when I talked to Carrie Elwes once, and I told him all the people I'd worked with, he goes, "Oh my God, I'm shocked you're still in the business."
Was Daniel
Carrie's
the best?
great.
Who was the worst one though? Who was the one that you're
I
like,
don't know.
I
Again, I
can't
think they
defend
were
anybody?
all challenging in their own way. And
Because
that's, you know,
here's what I tell people, and it's truth. I always say celebrities are like any other group of folks. 80 or 90% of them are fine. You may get somebody on a bad day, but you can kind of tell that's a bad day. There's something going on. Less than 10% are complete assholes, like most people.
true. But I also like Luke Perry, amazing guy. Roger Moore, amazing guy.
So I
And
thought James would ask about Roger Moore. You got to work with Bond.
he was my childhood Bond. And my favorite memories of being in Luxembourg, where we shot that movie,
Hmm.
he called me author. Oh, the author is here, So he was but he was a little bit stiff in those days, but he was a big wine. He loved wine and food. So he was a man after my own heart.
Yes.
Um, and it was one of the thrills of my life. And I often say that because you get to work with people that are your childhood heroes. But yeah, Roger Moore was definitely up there. Luke Perry, incredibly nice guy. Um, God, I'm trying to remember.
Ray Liotta. You worked with Ray
Ray
Liotta?
Liotta. Well, I never directly worked with Ray. I did rewrites on a production when they were in
Inferno
Mexico.
Pilgrim, right?
Yeah, exactly. I did the production rewrites like 3 weeks before they were going to shoot. They needed this script revamped, and so I went at it, and um, I was so thrilled to write a movie for Ray Liotta. I said, "Oh my God, I'm going to write a bunch of Ray Liotta dialogue," and I did. And the director comes back and says, "I can't shoot this." I go, "What do you mean? It's great Ray Liotta dialogue." He says, "Yeah, it's going to be like a Saturday Night Live sketch. Ray Liotta saying these cliche Ray Liotta lines. It's going to be over the top." Sure enough, cut it all out. Ray Liotta brought enough of himself. I didn't have to overdo it. But yeah, I've worked with. I mean, I can't even. There's so many. Coolio, remember Coolio?
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
He was awesome. Such a nice guy.
We
Uh,
have I could be here for the next 3 hours. How about we
okay,
do this? How about we do
do
this?
another one.
How that was about to say. How about I give you 2 or 3 weeks off, and in the next month or two, we have you back on the show.
And I
Love it.
will read your book before then because I want to read it and I want to have a conversation. So I
Does
would
that
love
sound
to
good?
do that.
But
Do it. And
before
I
we,
apologize for talking too much,
Oh
guys.
no,
no, that's your
no.
job, motherfucker.
That's what we dream of
Hopefully you
this.
got that's coming from love, that I'm treating you
Okay,
as a friend.
appreciate it.
No,
Yeah,
if I've had a quarter, Greg Nicotero, the great Nicotero, was walking off a stage in October. Was like, I talk too much. I was like, damn it, That's what the fuckers were out here for, was to listen to you. No one wants to listen to me. No one comes for the interview or the moderator. So
That's so
before we
funny.
go, I want you to plug your new company and talk about any other projects you have coming on. Can you do that?
Dark Arts Entertainment, we're coming out with 3 new movies this year. One of them is going to be a special edition 4K remaster of Zizek's Road.
Mm-hmm.
The other one's called Terror Firma, which is a really cool acid trip kind of horror movie. And the third one is a real darkly satiric metaphor on how performers are exploited in the adult film industry, and it's called Snuff Queen.
So what I'm hearing is that Bonehead Weekly should get the exclusives, and we should try to do some set visits. This is what I'm hearing, but
Well, they're all
clearly I know
shot. They're all shot,
Oh,
but
son of a bitch.
you come see me first and we'll do it. Yeah, we're distribution. And I want to throw this out to your listeners. We are actively looking for emerging genre filmmakers who have projects. Brian and I come in, we on different levels of the project. If it's finished shooting, we recut with them. We shape the movies and get them ready for the commercial marketplace. And we offer distribution on filmmaker terms. We do limited, we don't lock up movies forever. We do 3-year terms. I involve the filmmakers in the artwork and all that stuff. I work with MVD. We always do physical media, either DVDs or Blu-rays. We always, with every release. And so that's a real attraction for filmmakers. So we think we have a great little platform to be able to work with emerging genre filmmakers. We prep them. We work as executive producers if we get involved early. And we shape movies. We have a number of movies that are in different phases. Yeah, Dark Arts Entertainment is something that we are launching now. And we should come back and I'll tell you what the movies are as they come up.
Yes, please.
I will absolutely. And if you want to have Brian come on with you, that would be great too.
He could do that too. Has he been on?
No, I've only ever been in the room with him, and
Okay.
oddly enough, Jeffrey Combs, Barbara Crampton, Kathy. I don't know. Do you know Kathy Charles, the screenwriter? She wrote one of the. That's okay.
But I'm good friends with Barbara and
Right.
Jeffrey. I know them both.
And so, but apropos of nothing, thank you so much. We'll have you back on. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm going to push stop. John, this has been an honor.
You guys, you're awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.